Hypothetical question. If you had to choose between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament, which one would you choose? If your answer is anything other than, they're the same God, it's a false question, you might have some heretical tendencies we need to deal with. While popular conceptions of the Bible would lead us to believe that the God of the Old Testament is one of anger and revenge, and the God of the New Testament is one of love and forgiveness, when we actually read the Bible, the story looks quite different. This is Catholicism in Focus. When we look to the most exciting passages of the Old Testament, the ones that are most often depicted in popular media, it's easy to see how God is often portrayed in a negative light. He wipes out the entire earth with a flood, confuses people with speech so they won't be able to communicate, and destroys 2 major cities with everyone still in them. And that's just in the first book of the Bible. Throughout its pages, it's not uncommon to see God depicted as a warrior, filled with anger and exacting revenge on his enemies. Because these are fairly powerful images that don't always fit with our expectations of God, it's hard not to define the Old Testament God as angry and simply ignore him when we get to the kinder Jesus. Which is a shame, because there is so much more at work here. For every moment of anger we see from God in the Old Testament, there are dozens of instances of love, mercy, patience, and most of all, fidelity. Take, for example, the story of the Kingdom of Israel. On the surface, all we see is that God got angry with the people, and so willed that they be destroyed by a foreign nation, scattering them around the world. Not a great snapshot of God. But look at the story in full, starting all the way back in Exodus. Enslaved by the Egyptians and forced to worship Pharaoh, God hears the cry of the Israelites and sets them free. Leading them to the desert, he provides all of their needs, giving them food, protection, land, and even making a covenant of love with them. As long as they keep the law he sets before them, worshiping him exclusively and acting with justice, he will keep them as his treasured possession. And what do? No more than a few chapters later, they make a golden calf to worship, breaking their end of the deal. But does he forget the covenant and have them all killed, as was the terms of the agreement? No. They continue to live, and he continues to be their God. What's more, their children are still allowed to enter the promised land, even though the people had broken the covenant. And so goes the story for 1,000 years. Israel disobeys God, God gets angry, but ultimately forgives them. Time and time again, they make false idols, worship other gods, oppress the poor, steal from the widow, and completely disregard God's justice. They live with evil in their hearts, and God continues to forgive them. He sends prophets to warn them and miracles to win them back. Throughout the prophetic writings, God speaks as a husband who has been cheated on, hurt and disgusted, but wanting to win Israel back. For 1,000 years, he was loving, merciful, patient, and absolutely faithful to a covenant that the people didn't deserve. Until enough was enough, and he allowed them to be destroyed. They received the punishment they had deserved for a millennia. Angry God, right? Except his anger lasts for but a moment. Within 2 generations, he offers the people forgiveness, restores their nation, and tries again. He shows love, mercy, patience, and faithfulness once more, only to have Israel disobey him again. When we look at the instances of God's anger within the larger story of salvation history, what we are left with is not a God that is angry by nature, but a God who is actually remarkably well-tempered and is far more merciful than we would ever be. So, sure, the God of the Old Testament wasn't as bad as we think, but how can you beat the love of Jesus, right? Clearly, there is still a big difference between how Jesus treats his people and how the Old Testament God does. While the conception that many people have of Jesus is of a free-loving hippie that preached a message of peace and forgiveness, never doing anything unkind to anyone, the Gospels tell a different story. Once again, when we look to the most exciting passages of the New Testament, those that are most often depicted in popular media, it's easy to see how Jesus is often portrayed in such a positive light. But dig a little below the surface, and you will see a God that might even be more harsh than that of the Old Testament. Take, for instance, his preaching. While most of us will think immediately of his words of forgiveness and love, the majority of what he says is actually quite extreme and forceful. He comes to cast the mighty from their thrones and lift up the lowly. By his own admission, he did not come to bring peace, but the sword, creating divisions within religion and among families. Jesus demands faith and has absolutely no patience for his adversaries. Rather than giving them time or overlooking their faults, like is often seen in the case of the Old Testament, He calls them hypocrites and publicly shames them. What's worse is when we compare the consequences for turning away from God between the Testaments. In the Old Testament, the worst that God does is inflict pain on the body, or in extreme cases, cause physical death. But compare that to Jesus' words to the Pharisees, how he plans on judging the nations in Matthew 25, or what will come at the end of times in the book of Revelation. Not only do people risk their mortal lives, Jesus threatens them with the damnation of their souls. I'm not sure about you, but that sounds a lot worse. And yet entirely consistent with what we see in the Old Testament from God. While the specific words and stories might be different, the overall revelation of God's nature is the exact same. God loves freely and widely, demands fidelity, and rejects those who are arrogant enough to think that they don't need God. Although seemingly different on the surface, there is only one God. The God of the Old Testament is the God of the New Testament. And this presents an interesting predicament for us, doesn't it? For if there is but one God, that means that the God of humility and peace we see in the New Testament is the same one that wages wars on his enemies in the Old Testament. But it also presents us with a rather wonderful opportunity. The opportunity to have our false conceptions of God challenged and recalibrated. It's an opportunity to see that the law of God in the Old Testament actually demands love of one's enemy. That many of the miracles of Jesus were first enacted 1,000 years before his earthly birth. And that even in his anger, the God of old was the source of love and fidelity for the world. If this sounds strange to us or we can't seem to reconcile the two testaments with one another, maybe it's time we took a closer look at what we actually know about each and find that there's still more to learn about God than we could ever know.